Punctual on this otherwise, horrific weather day. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll be joined by a few others, but you guys get the benefit of the full picture, actually, for our time. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. This is a center for nonpartisan dialogue and advanced policy research. Very pleased today to be talking about an issue that I think is on many people's minds here, which is questions of social policy, trade, and economic reform in Mexico. This project, which is a joint project of CIDE and the Woodrow Wilson Center, for those of you who don't know CIDE, an outstanding institution of higher education, both a bit, I always explain it, both Mauricio Merino and John Scott, who are here, represent CIDE, but an outstanding institution of higher learning. They do have students at both an undergraduate and graduate level, but also functions a bit like a think tank. I mean, they're sort of a little bit in between both. And have been fabulous partners on this project, which was supported by the Hewlett Foundation. This is a project that's taken almost 3 years, I would say. Jonathan Fox will explain it. He's really the leader on this project to look at how agricultural subsidies, the influence of agricultural subsidies on poverty and on trade adjustment in Mexico. And I will not steal his thunder by trying to explain what he knows better than me. But let me introduce briefly the people who are up here. And then turn it over to Jonathan. Jonathan Fox is, I think everyone has bios for the folks here, so I won't repeat bios. I would say Jonathan Fox, aside from being a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, is someone who's been deeply involved in public thought and policy issues, especially on transparency, as longtime chair of the Bank Information Center, on the board of Oxfam, former fellow at the Wilson Center, deeply involved with this center's work on U.S.-Mexico migration, as well as this project. And a previous project you have out there on transparency. Libby Haight, who was the co-editor of this, also involved, one of the co-editors of this publication as well, someone who has been deeply involved with the Wilson Center for a number of years, as well as with a number of other organizations, working closely on transparency issues, particularly in rural Mexico, is now with the International Budget Project, the Center for Budget Policy Priorities, but has a long involvement in Mexico and has lived in Mexico for many years, and always tease her that she's bastante mexicanizada at this point. Mauricio Merino, I think most of you in this room probably know Mexico. Mauricio Merino is one of Mexico's leading thinkers in public policy, in the process of decision-making, strong advocate on questions of transparency and questions of the civil service career, has been involved in almost every major issue in Mexican public life in recent years, and many of you will know him from his time on the Mexico's Federal Electoral Institute, the IFE, where he served during the 7 years, the period of Jose Waldenberg, was one of the leading counselors on that institute. John Scott, I'm sure many of you have read his work if you don't know him personally, one of Mexico's leading thinkers on social policy, someone who's worked extensively with both in Mexico. He serves on the board of Coneval, which is the evaluation arm of the Mexican government, but also has worked very closely with the World Bank, the IDB, OECD, someone who has written extensively on everything from education to healthcare to agricultural subsidies, looking at how you make social policy more equitable, and doing the kind of things that most of us wish we could do, which is sort of run the numbers and say, what does this really look like? I mean, who's actually benefiting from the programs that are out there? What does this mean for Mexico's future? And Tim Wise, I think many of you know, in Washington, longtime director of Grassroots International, now at Tufts University, deeply involved in writing about a number of issues, but particularly looking at rural communities, particular love for Mexico, but he does it around the world, and looking at questions of equity and also in the context of U.S. agricultural policy and trade, and has written very extensively about this. So let me turn over to Jonathan Fox. Let me recognize, by the way, Diana Negroponte, one of our board members of the Mexico Institute, who's over here as well, and several other good friends in this room, and turn over to Jonathan Fox to run this game.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to the Mexico Institute for hosting this project, and thanks to the Hewlett Foundation for support. And it's been great to work with CIDE which has co-published the report. And let me just throw in a shout out to a couple of Santa Cruz students here who have braved the East Coast winter. Power to you there. The study basically takes off from some of the original questions that were widely discussed at the time of the NAFTA debate. And one of the basic principles of the political economy of trade is that in principle, trade has winners and losers, and the gains are supposed to be greater than the losses. And it's really the challenge is how can institutions be created to be able to compensate the losers, lead to net positive gains. And that leads to the question of what can make these institutions work. And one of the surprise punchlines to this study really is that the Mexican government did spend a substantial amount of money on compensating some agricultural producers in Mexico. And that's what led us to take on basically a follow-the-money approach to looking at who gets what, taking apart the agricultural budget, looking at change over time. It's a long-term study looking over the last 15 years. And we brought to bear a diverse set of perspectives, institutional analysis, political analysis, economic analysis, national overview, focus on the role of trade, as well as more bottom-up, field-based producer's eye studies. And we're just one group within a larger set of authors, and hopefully there were enough copies for everyone. And I just want to do a quick run through of some of the big picture questions. And one of the huge surprises is that corn production went up after NAFTA, when everyone on all sides of the debate expected that it would go down. There was much less moving into other crops than was hoped for or than was promised. Corn imports went up, but the production of white corn for household human consumption went up. So what's going on? And analysts really haven't even framed this as a question. The focus in the debate has been on increased imports, often to the exclusion of the simultaneous increase in production. Many people assumed that with the dominant ideology informing national policy in terms of turning more to market mechanisms, they assumed that the government pulled out from subsidizing agriculture, and that simply didn't happen. So what we found is really that there was both continued protection for some producers through the Ingreso Objetivo program, which paid approximately 250,000 producers in the north the difference between the domestic price and the international price, and $20 billion of total, that's in real terms, in total transfer payments to farmers. So if we look at production, we see production reaches record levels since 1980, and not only in irrigated zones, which is irrigated production. The blue bar certainly went up quite a bit, especially in Sinaloa, with very high rates of productivity reaching 10, 12 tons a hectare without having to turn to genetically modified seeds. But grain-fed production still represents the bulk of domestic production. So what's going on here? We see agricultural spending go up since hitting bottom around 2000, 2001, almost doubling, a reflection of the new checks and balances in the Mexican political system and the influence of producer organizations in Congress. We see farm employment, though, dropping at the same time. And so what that suggests is that there's a disconnect between more money for agriculture, but fewer people actually having jobs in agriculture. This gives you brief, and all this data is in the report, but basically you can see that the peso crisis in the mid-90s leading to a drop in ag spending, the peak in 94 had something to do with presidential elections. But then since that trough in 2000, 2001, we see that steady rise, and the green bar covers the funds that are basically checks to individual producers. Procampo is one of those programs. Ingreso Objetivo is another. And so when we turn to the who gets what question, that quickly led to the issue of to what degree has the Mexican government's transparency reform, have they really been applied to the agricultural sector? And we saw a mixed picture there. We saw we saw some progress in a couple of the largest programs. You can go online and see data on beneficiaries for Procampo and Ingreso Objetivo, and one of Mexico's flagship public interest groups, Fundar, has put online a much more user-friendly version of that official data, subsidiosalcampo.org.mx, if you want to see which of your favorite elected officials has been receiving farm subsidies. But it turns out that even that apparently very transparent data is rather opaque. It lacks sufficient precision to really know in a fine-grained way who's getting what. And Libby will addressing that to a degree. There's a whole chapter just on the data issues that make it hard to know who's getting what. And on the accountability side, we found very little in the way of progress in terms of institutional mechanisms that would allow producers themselves or civil society watchdogs to actually try to fulfill the potential to improve the performance of the public sector through accountability mechanisms. And that has to do with a general unwillingness of both the federal and the state governments to partner with independent, nonpartisan producer organizations to try to improve public sector performance. And we also found that even within the most pro-poor program, which is Procampo, which is the leading compensation program, there still was a very lopsided distribution of resources. The most straightforward reason having to do with the fact that it's a per hectare payment, so you have more hectares, you get more payments. But the two, that's not news. The two more interesting findings, the 2.2 here that came from John Scott's research was that the majority of the smallest producers aren't even on the rolls. They were left off the rolls for reasons that we could discuss. Even though it's a program that was designed to be able to reach the smallest of the small minifundistas. And then another point that came through in the research was that Procampo is organized in a way that pays irrigated producers twice in the same year because they've got two crops. But it's a program that was designed to pay producers based on their amount of land, not on their amount of production. It's supposed to be decoupled from production. So the only explanation, and we reconstructed this historically talking with policymakers, the only reason for including that second harvest payment was because of the political cloud of vested interests, especially large, well-organized producers in the state of Sinaloa. And then another factor behind the bias, and Tim Wise has a whole chapter and a larger monograph that goes into the question of just what was the cost to Mexican producers of U.S. Dumping and so forth. So this gives you a flavor of the geographic distribution of the Procampo payments for a typical year, 2008, and we see states like Sinaloa, Tamaulipas, even a state with a quite small number of producers, Zacatecas, Jalisco, getting a substantial piece of the action, but also not small amounts going to Chiapas, Oaxaca, Veracruz, where you have many more small producers. And both the report and the Subsidios al Campo database can give you much more fine-grained analysis of the distribution of the funds. But Procampo is just the most well-known subsidy program. It's not the only one, and the long list of other programs, and the fact that there are so many of these other programs complicates matters when trying to figure out how many producers are getting the benefits from 3, 4, 5, 6 programs at once. These are under the rubric of marketing support, and these are the ones that are highly targeted to the large-scale producers in the north, even large transnational corporations, and there's a box in the report that provides the actual figures in terms of what Cargill is getting. And we basically came to conclusions very similar to those of the World Bank Public Expenditure Review on Agriculture, which underscores the way in which the agriculture spending is regressive, and that helps to cancel out a large part of the pro-poor distribution of social spending, particularly oportunidades. And so here you get a flavor of how ingreso objetivo, this basically trade protection for the rich program really comes down. This program, since the international increase in grain prices, this particular program is no longer necessary, at least for now, while corn prices are very high. And it's been replaced by another form of protection for the same core group of about 200 and 250,000 producers, which is called coberturas. And this is a program where the government subsidizes crop insurance that uses the international futures markets. It's very clever, very sophisticated, very effective, but it's also a way in which the state intervention is protecting the largest grain producers from the international price swings. So it's not that Mexico used to be protectionist and now there's a free market, used to be protectionist and now there's a segment of producers who are still protected thanks to state intervention, and then the rest of producers who are no longer protected. And we'll hear more about that. So I'm going to leave plenty of time for our other speakers. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that all the material is fully online, not only the report, but also a series of a dozen monographs, which include the full unexpurgated long versions of the chapters by Tim and John and Mauricio, as well as other authors, studies of oportunidades, studies of farm credit, and so forth, and it's a list that will grow. So for those of you who are specialists who want to hone in, keep an eye on that monograph series. And without further ado, I'll turn to Mauricio, and we're going to go in the order that we're seated. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank, of course, to the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Hewlett Foundation, and especially to Andrew Seeley for his invitation to the project and to this presentation, and to Jonathan Fox for his excellent coordination of this project. Thank you, all of you guys. I prefer to read my presentation because I think it is better for you and for me to understand what I try to say. My chapter focused on the disconnect between the policy's many goals and on the one hand, and its actual design and implementation on the other. I take a metaphor proposed by Giandomenico Maggione, who has suggested that public policies like scientific research programs have a hard core. At the heart of the policies, there always should be a definition of the problem that the state is trying to deal with, the criteria and values that guides intervention, and its specific intended goals. Maggione says that policies also have a kind of safety belt, which is made up by rules, resources, functions, actions, and agencies in charge of carrying out the policies, and that the safety belt should be adjusted along the way. My study shows what happens when the hard core of a policy is not well defined, and instead it is bound by an excessively rigid safety belt, unable to adapt to new circumstances, even when it is already obvious that the policy is no longer meeting their goals. After studying the policies to grant agricultural subsidies in Mexico from 1994 to 2009, focusing on Procampo, as Jonathan Fox said before, we had found that the combination of an ill-defined and relaxed hard core with a rigid safety belt resulted actually in the capture of the resources, the deviation of policy goals, and for sure in acts of corruption. It was evident that after 15 years of implementation, none of the 6 main goals of Procampo have been achieved in a stable or permanent way. The 6 original goals, quoting the creation decree of the program, were the next. 1. Improving internal and external competitiveness, raising rural families' living standards, and modernizing the market system in order to increase the rural unit's capacity for capitalization. Second, giving economic certainty to rural producers and increasing their capacity to adapt to change. 3. Promoting new alliances between the social and the private sectors through the adoption of more advanced technologies. 4. Improving the income of the more than 2.2 million rural producers that use their production for household consumption. 5. Achieving environmental conservation goals. And 6. Supporting rural producers by means of a program that raises the standard of living. Well, after 15 years, we may say that increased public spending has not translated into a more competitive agricultural sector, nor in a sustained increase in production, nor in an improvement in the standard of living of the more disadvantaged producers. We saw that the farm subsidy policy should follow two-track strategy. On one hand, the richer states of the Northwest should have increased their competitiveness, productions, and productivity. And on the other hand, the poorer states of the South and Center should have reduced their poverty, but neither of these situations had happened. The data available suggest that the programs have been maintained because of the commitments established with those who have benefited the most, economically speaking, and because of the political networks that have converged around the subsidies. There is also evidence that the implementation of those programs has created many opportunities for corruption. But perhaps the most solid explanation of these programs' continuity without modifications or deeply modifications would be in the prior construction of clientelistic networks and mutually beneficial relationships that neither the producer organizations nor the federal government have been able to break. On the contrary, each time there has been an effort to modify these relationships or to give more transparency to the programs, the conflict has avoided. Nevertheless, everybody knows where's the problem. The federal audit and official data showed a strong concentration of Procampo, as Jonathan said before, between 1994 and 2006. 0.2 of the beneficiaries received payments which represent 8.7 of the total payments, whilst 24% of the producers registered with less than 1 hectare each barely receive 0.6 of the resources. Recently, the federal government decided to review the program's rules of operation, but only to establish a barrier in order to stop the subsidies given to the farms with more than 100 hectares. The proposition was to seek a better balance between income groups and regions through the raise of the subsidies targeted to the smallest farms by reducing payments to large producers. There was, of course, no opposition to the former, but it was a strong opposition to the latter, especially from the states that have received the most subsidies, like Sinaloa and Tamaulipas. According to Procampo and Ingreso Objetivo's current manager, such opposition also involved the struggle of local politicians and social leaders who control the registries and the payments. According to the manager in charge of payments during this research, a bank check could be held up for a year, and very often the corruption was involved in getting cash through intermediates. From the point of view of the federal officials, the state governments also launched their offensive against new rules for Procampo and Ingreso Objetivo because their state agriculture secretaries have been fighting to be the ones who give out the money to do politics, left and right. And on the other hand, the policy permits that one individual or one organization could register many different farms in various parts of the country, making it difficult to determine exactly who is receiving and how much and where. Moreover, the system created the possibility of people receiving checks in the name of others it was not until the public interest group Fundar launched the Subsidios al Campo website when official beneficiary data became publicly accessible in practice, revealing the highly unequal distribution of the subsidy payments and the names of beneficiaries who were public servants or even relatives of several well-known drug dealers. It was found for sure that many agricultural officials in charge of those programs were listed in the registry and that they have received program subsidies. We found coincidences of the names of 57 public servants of the agricultural sector who could be beneficiaries of the money that they managed. In summary, as identified in this chapter of the study, the flaws in the definition of the problem that farm subsidy programs were supposed to address not only facilitated the early capture of the resources by the biggest political organization of rural producers from the very beginning of the program, but the deviation of the program's goals, converting them into an instrument used by the Mexican state to sustain the political networks and base of support in the countryside. In the best scenario, these resources can be seen as having contributed to social stability and greater political dialogue with powerful agribusiness and peasant organizations, but they did not level the playing field between farmers in Mexico, US, and Canada. Now, I ask for 2 minutes more to give you an epilogue of this chapter. From the day these conclusions were public in Mexico till now, it happened some important outcomes. The President Calderón said that it was unacceptable that the main subsidy program to Mexican agriculture was subsidizing the richest farmers and not the peasants who really need it. He thus announced a year ago his instruction to review the register list of beneficiaries to avoid that deviation. 1 year later, that revision of the register list has not finished, and the list is still almost the same of 1994. Another outcome was that once we got the evidence enough to demonstrate, like at least 57 public servants of the agricultural sector were beneficiaries of the subsidies, I decided to give that evidence to the Secretary of the Public Function, Secretaría de la Función Pública, in order to begin a formal investigation. Instead to run with that investigation and give a legal interpretation of the facts, the Secretary of the Función Pública decided to send my legal complaint to the local governments, asking them to answer directly to me. It was a weird procedure. But a point to remark is that none of them initiated a legal process against the functionaries. And each answer to my complaint was completely different. Now we know that one of the beneficiaries of the subsidies is the Secretary of Agriculture of the federal government himself. A third outcome was the removal of the former functionaries in charge of the subsidy programs, both the director of Acerca and the director of Procampo, on useful decision. The people ahead of the programs changed, but not the policy, and not the safety belt of the policy. And finally, the most recent news is the governmental decision to hide the names of the beneficiaries from the register lists for security reasons. They say that it could be dangerous to maintain those names already given to the public in the last 2 years because the gangs of the organized crime could take the list for extortion purpose. So, for the government, it is preferable to avoid transparency. Anyway, this study is not asking at all for the elimination of the subsidies or the cancellation of the programs. What we see is the necessity to narrow their goals to the subsidies for the smallest farms and the poorest producers, and to design another kind of policy to help the greatest to increase their production and productivity. And we see as well the need to improve the transparency all the way, and of course to cancel deviations and corruptions. Difficult tasks taking into account the heavy weight of the political organizations involved in this policy, and for the worst, the political timing in which we are. Thank you.
Thanks, Mauricio. I'm going to swap seats with John here. While John finds the PowerPoint, let me just add, after it was revealed to the press that Secretary Mayorga was on the rolls, he indicated he had a different interpretation of federal law regarding conflict of interest than Dr. Merino, and the classic phrase was "ni por ética" would he renounce his right to both be a public servant and receive public subsidies. So that phrase will now go down in history. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again also for the Wilson Center and the invitation to Washington and to the project, and to Jonathan for the coordination of this study and inviting me to participate. I want to provide some of the data which are behind a lot of what Jonathan said, and you can find much more probably too much in the book and in the chapter that I wrote. Basically, what we're going to see is that agricultural subsidies in Mexico are extremely inequitable, as they are in many other parts of the world. In the U.S., for example, the difference is that in Mexico, that's particularly the cost of that is particularly high because fiscal capacity in Mexico is very low, 10% of GDP in terms of non-oil taxation, and so the sort of opportunity cost, the redistributive opportunity cost of these resources is very high. I'm going to try also to explain why it is that resources are distributed in this way. First, let me just, I think it was already clear from Jonathan's presentation, spending was reduced in the 80s following the debt crisis, and then it increased again in the last decade. And if you see this, these are the large categories of instruments which are used to subsidize agriculture. What you see in red was one of the most original reforms, which was the creation of Procampo, which, as Jonathan mentioned, is decoupled. No, that means that it doesn't depend on production, on how much you produce. It depends on your land, independently of whether you are very productive or you sell your production and for how much. And that has two big implications. One is that, in principle, it doesn't distort economic decisions. And the other is that it has distributive implications. It's the first time that the government actually, the post-revolutionary governments, actually succeeded in transferring cash to small farmers, to subsistence farmers. That was one of the main implications, because you can get it for even for less than 1 hectare, and even though it's regressive, it's still the least regressive of the programs that we have, because all the other ones basically are linked not just to your property of land, but to how productive your property of land. And as larger properties are much more productive, they get much more of the other subsidies. one measure of whether Mexico spends too much or too little on agricultural subsidies is how it compares, how the percentage spending on agricultural subsidies compares to the size of the agricultural sector in Mexico in relation to the rest of the economy. And this is what this measures on different. It's not so easy to measure how much countries spend on agriculture. No, there are some measures which include only purely agricultural programs, and other include also other rural developments. And then that shows some of the numbers. And it's clear that basically we don't spend small, even after the contraction, we spend quite a lot. On some measures, we spent more than any other Latin American countries. That's the FAO's estimate, for example, which includes a lot of rural spending, which is not really agriculture. Then, despite that spending, if we look at poverty in Mexico, which is what we're looking at here, most of spending is, most of poverty is concentrated, extreme poverty is concentrated still in the rural sector. Even though the rural sector has contracted, it's only about 25% of the population. It accounts for about 65% of the poor, and as you can see, it has accounted for that in a fairly stable way. No? These are the blue columns here. Now, if this is a bit more recent data, in Mexico, poverty is officially measured through an income and expenditure survey, which is we have every 2 years. So we don't have information yet on 2010, but we do have other sources like labor surveys, and what they show is that poverty has increased a lot in the last 2008, 2009, and 2010, but not rural poverty. The rural poverty is what we see here in the green line, and urban poverty is what we see in the orange line. This is not exactly poverty. This is how many people are under the poverty line based only on labor income. So it's a tendency. It's not absolute numbers starting at 2005, but it shows that poverty in the country increased a lot in the last year, associated with both the food crisis, the financial crisis, and now we don't have the data yet, but certainly with the prices of increasing prices of foods in very recent months, we might have another of these movements, but not in the rural sector. No, as you can see, in the rural sector, it has been fairly flat. That reflects the fact that both the rural sector is fairly isolated from the economy, from the formal economy, and also the fact that they are producers as well as consumers of food. So the increasing food prices has ambiguous effects. No? Now, what's interesting, and the main point I want to make is that the agricultural sector in Mexico is extremely heterogeneous. And what we have here is poverty rates, rural poverty rates for the states, starting with Chiapas to Baja California, ordered by poverty rates. And we see that goes from 10%, which is in Baja California, Colima, etc., to 60% in Chiapas. No? So this is extreme poverty rates in 2005, which is the last census information which was available to do this kind of analysis. So the agricultural sector in Chiapas is completely different from the agricultural sector in the north. And what we see in the curves are sort of concentration curves. That means that, for example, I don't know if this says, yes, the 6 poorest countries account for about 60% of poverty. And what we have here is how much they get, how much of the agricultural GDP is produced in those countries. Okay, so this is GDP cumulatively, and this is poverty. And then if we look at policy, what we have here, this is social policy in rural areas, and this is agricultural subsidies. So as you can see, social policies is basically goes to the states according to poverty rates, and agricultural spending goes according to GDP, agricultural GDP. So this is a very straightforward division of labor between these two instruments. but the result is that you have basically no or very few resources spent on productive capacities of poor producers. No, the poor in rural areas are served through social policy like oportunidades, and the rich are served through agricultural subsidies. So there's no pro-poor productive subsidies, really. And that's a major limitation of agricultural policy in Mexico today. Now, that's not just in part, as Mauricio very well mentioned and researched, in part it's a political economy issue. The rich have captured historically, since Cárdenas to today, a lot of the subsidies. But in part it's also that it's much more difficult to actually, for a state which has weak institutional capacities, to identify from a set of 3 million producers to target productive subsidies specific to each producer is very difficult to do. So it's very easy to actually concentrate on subsidies which are very easy to implement, and those tend to be subsidies which are a simple function of how much you sell. The simplest is to subsidize through international trade, and those are very inequitable by design. So in part it's the constraint which the distribution and the heterogeneity of farmers in Mexico impose. Now, let me show here quickly just that how one of the things which has changed a lot since in the last 20 years is that rural households, even poor rural households, really don't depend on agriculture anymore. Now, agriculture has stopped being a way for the poor to actually escape poverty or to live, to gain resources in rural areas. This is wage income from farming activities and non-wage income also from farming activities. And as you can see, it accounts for a very small share, 30% in the case of the poorest. These are deciles, no? The poorest 10%, the richest 10% in the rural area. So, and this, what's in red, is a non-farm income, so wage income. So most of the income for the non-poor in rural areas, or not so poor, is not related to agriculture, it's related to other rural activities. And for the poor, public transfers, like oportunidades and Procampo, have become a big source of income. Let me jump here. Let me jump to the distribution of programs. These are concentration coefficients, which is like the Gini coefficient but applied to public spending. And basically everything which is positive is regressive, and everything which is negative is progressive, pro-poor, and the larger the lines, the more progressive and the more regressive. And so we have some, all these are social programs. PET is an employment program, oportunidades, desayunos escolares, etc. These are very progressive. And these are the agricultural subsidies, which are extremely regressive, notably Ingreso Objetivo, which was mentioned before. Procampo, as you can see, is not so regressive, but still is on the regressive side. And this is the same, but with taking Procampo versus Ingreso Objetivo. And you can see, for example, this means that in the case of Procampo, 10%, the 10% largest farmers, richest farmers, get 90% of Procampo. So this gives you an idea of the concentration of this. Get 90% of Ingreso Objetivo. And about something like 30% of Procampo, not 35% of Procampo. Okay? So there's a large difference between these two programs. Unfortunately, most programs are probably, we don't have that information for a lot of programs, but most are basically allocated according to land, and especially land with irrigation, because your probability of getting subsidies grows as your productivity grows. So this would be a good approximation of other subsidies. Now, well, this is a much more detailed graph where we have basically here we have the Zagarpa programs, the agricultural programs, which get where the richest 40% get something like 90%, and these are the poorest. The social programs where exactly the same happens, but the other way. No, the poorest 40% get most of the resources. Here we have indigenous CDI programs, some CESOL programs, etc. No? So there is this very clear division of labor between social policy and agricultural subsidies. What is the effect? Why is that? And that division of labor, by the way, is intentional. It's part of the policy historically in Mexico. Zagarpa doesn't have a brief of attending the poor. The idea is that CEDESOL, the social ministry, serves the poor, and then Zagarpa is there to increase production, agricultural production. The problem is there are some problems with that argument of dividing the two issues. One is that, as you can see here, because agricultural subsidies are fairly large in relation to the agricultural GDP, it's actually, and because they are very inequitable, it's one of the main causes of rural income inequality in Mexico. So basically, we will see in a moment, the distributive effect of social policy is undermined, it's destroyed, if we measure it in terms of income inequality, by the regressive effect of agricultural subsidies. No? So that's one problem, that you have two policies fighting in opposite directions in terms of redistribution. And the second problem is that the idea that the best way to invest, the most productive way to invest agricultural subsidies is to do it on the larger producers. That's also rather of a myth. No? Agriculture, the big producers, because they have historically received so many subsidies, the opportunity to increase their productivity through more subsidies is not very large. On the other hand, there are middle-income producers, smaller ones, where there's a lot of opportunity to increase their productivity, and they cannot get these subsidies. No? So it's not, both in terms of efficiency and in terms of equity, it's not a good allocation. Let me finish with this. Now, this is what I mentioned. Here we have, this is the effect on the Gini coefficient of agricultural spending. It increases it. That means it makes inequality higher in the rural sector. This is the effect of rural spending. So the net effect is still redistributive, but basically half of the effect of rural spending is destroyed by agricultural spending. No? This is looking at exclusively in terms of income distribution in the agricultural sector. Of course, the poor gain from both programs. No? Even though they gain very little from agricultural policy, they still gain. And the poorest 10%, for example, receive about 60% if you sum all of the transfers in terms of the transfers represent 60% of their income. The rich less. So overall, if you combine two, it's still progressive in relative terms, but basically it's much less efficient as a redistributive instrument than it would be if you could target productive subsidies better. No? So my final point would be, what would be the policy implications of this? Well, the optimal policy, first, that you have to understand that the rural sector in Mexico is extremely heterogeneous. So you have at least three groups which you have to treat very differently. Large producers, which are almost agro-businesses in some cases. In one extreme, middle producers who do have problems in terms of accessing capital, credit, technology, etc., who would be the optimal targets of agricultural policy, and very small subsistent producers which subsist only because, in part, because they receive pro campo and transfers like that, and those really, those which are not productively viable, should really be getting other ways, their social protection in some other ways, in some normal ways, instead of through agricultural policy. They should receive social security, etc. No? Now they basically use a lot the land, and the subsidies associated with the land as a way of receiving social protection. they should receive social protection directly, because that means that that land is not used for productive purposes. No? So basically, that would be the.
Thanks, John. We're now going to turn to Libby. Thanks.
Hi, good afternoon. My thanks also to the Mexico Institute for their undying support for this work and also for hosting this event. I'm probably going to be very brief because Jonathan, Mauricio, and John have already made a lot of the very important points regarding the degree of transparency and access to public information in Mexico's major agricultural subsidy programs. I just want to go into a little bit more detail about what research we did in terms of trying to get a better feel for exactly how transparent these payments are in the grand scheme of things. We were basically driven by the question, the information that the government is publishing about how these payments are being distributed, how well does that allow the public, especially non-experts, to answer the question, who is getting what from these payments, and ultimately their money, given that it's public money. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, early in the Fox administration, the Mexican government implemented some groundbreaking transparency and access to public information reforms. And one of the things that those reforms did was mandate that the government proactively publish the recipient lists for all federal subsidy programs. So not limited to farm subsidy programs, but meaning that for the first time, the public was going to, without having to ask the government for this information, have access to the names and the amounts of money that farmers were being paid through these programs. One of the things that I think Mauricio's analysis does very well is show exactly what the effects of these policies operating, shrouded in a good deal of opacity for many years, what kinds of effects that has. And so the degree to which the government makes information available that can improve public debate about these policies, that can allow people to express their opinions about how these programs have developed over time, and therefore sort of improve the quality of the public debate about how these programs are going and what could be done to improve them, means that, reforms that make more information about the distribution of these programs available are important reforms in terms of improving the quality of the conversations that are being had about these programs. And one of the results of the research, as Jonathan and Mauricio have pointed out, is that despite these reforms, and despite the fact that even in the best case scenario, which is pro campo, where a lot of information is being published about who's getting payments through these programs, it's actually still very difficult to know with precision how many farmers are receiving payments, who they are, where they're located, and what they're receiving the payments for. The reason for that is to not get entirely too technical all at once, but because ultimately the information that's being published is a list of payments, not a list of farmers. So every time a check goes out, that check is registered, and that is the information that is being made available right now. What that means is that it's impossible to know if the same name that appears on this list multiple times is or is not effectively the same person. There are a number of scenarios under which a farmer could receive legitimately multiple payments from the same program. There are also instances where people illegitimately are receiving multiple payments from the same program. Right now, the information that's being available to the public does not make it possible for that degree of verification to occur. So therefore, when a name appears multiple times, it's impossible to know whether or not that is an appropriate use of the program's funds or not. At the same time, this publishing a list of payments as opposed to a list of farmers who are receiving payments allows for farmer organizations, cooperatives, or other types of groups of farmers to register within the program as one recipient. So in other words, the name of the cooperative will appear, and a large sum will be attached to that name, but we don't know how many different farmers belong to that cooperative, and therefore how that large payment is going to be distributed once it reaches that cooperative. We've made repeated efforts to obtain that information, and unfortunately have gotten a response that even the government doesn't really know necessarily how many farmers within those sort of groups of farmers are ultimately receiving payments. The reason that these kinds of questions are interesting to us, because one may question whether or not there's a critical mass of people who are all that interested in wading through 15 years worth of registries for 2 million farmers who have been receiving payments through these programs. But the fact of the matter is, when Mauricio released the results of a lot of his research, and at the same time, journalists also were picking up on a lot of what John was producing in terms of the distributional analysis of these programs, there was a good deal of public outrage in response to the fact that public funds were being used to pay sitting public officials subsidies for the programs they themselves are currently managing. I think that debate that happened through the media and in other outlets is an important debate that hadn't necessarily happened in those terms in relation to these particular programs until the information was made available that allowed for an analysis that showed that this was effectively happening. It didn't necessarily resolve the problem. There isn't necessarily a new consensus about what conflict of interest means, but it did raise the issue in a way that more people were involved in a conversation about whether or not we need to care that public officials are receiving payments from the programs they themselves manage. And I think that was an important reaction that shows that increasing access to this type of information does have a positive effect on the degree to which the public can engage with how these programs are operating, and including the urban population who isn't normally going to be engaged in a series of conversations about farm policy. At the same time, there was sort of a lot of reaction to the degrees of concentration in the distribution of these payments. There was a lot of questioning whether or not the public was comfortable with their money being used to support rich farmers, and that poor farmers were being left out, and whether or not the poor farmers who were being left out could potentially benefit more from being able to access these programs. I think that one of the types of conversations that also occurred as this information was being made more and more public, as the media was picking up on some of the important issues that these analyses were able to bring to light. And all of these analyses, were based on publicly available information that was the government's own information, which I think is an important point also to highlight. The farm subsidy database that Mauricio referenced does not produce any information about farm subsidy recipients. It simply makes the information that the government produces more accessible. And that also, I think, helped to socialize the resonance that the analysis that came out of that was going to have, because it showed that it's not necessarily an ideological position. It is what the government itself is explaining in terms of how it has been distributing payments over time. And in several of the occasions on which I've been able to participate in conversations about the results of this exercise, there's been some reaction from public officials to say, well, oftentimes we talk about the need to promote greater transparency, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about the cost of greater transparency. And there's a good deal of resistance to the fact that implementing Mexico's transparency and access to information reforms has been costly. It involved establishing public information offices. There's now public officials who are tasked with responding to citizen information requests, et cetera, et cetera. And even when some people would argue that the $40 million investment in quote-unquote cleaning up the Procampo recipient list is a cost to the public purse of transparency. I, however, do think that the results of the analysis that are presented in this report would lead one also to ask, what are the costs of opacity? And that's an important comparison to keep in mind when asked to sort of calculate the cost of transparency. It does sort of ignore the question of what was it costing to be operating so many years based largely on inertia or by captured interests or without necessarily subjecting the program's operation to the kind of public scrutiny that would ask questions about whether or not the program is serving the function for which it was created. And those costs, I think, are very evident in this analysis. And I do think that it's important to keep in mind that those costs far outweigh, in comparison, the costs of implementing a series of reforms that allow the public access to the fundamental basic information about how a program is operating and how their money is being spent, ultimately. And I think that as backlash continues to surface, and arguments are not only made about the cost of transparency, but as Mauricio was saying, now there's even a public security argument that's being brought into it, that farmers are now increasingly subject to extortion because those who would extort have access to information about what they're receiving in farm subsidy payments. And therefore the reaction right now is to use that as an argument to increase the opacity with which these programs are operating. And so it's sort of a step backwards that, as Mauricio was saying, seems to put public security policy within the realm of transparency policy, which doesn't necessarily coincide as obvious as that, I don't think. But it's a sad, let's say, it's a concerning progression of events when clear benefits to increasing the amount of information and the quality of information that is available to the public are being challenged by questions of cost or misinterpretations of what the ultimate benefits could be of it continuing to push the boundaries of how transparency and access to information reforms can contribute to improving the policy and conversations that are happening around those policies. So, thank you.
Thanks, Libby. We're now going to turn to Tim's analysis of the trade issues that gave rise to this whole agricultural subsidy policy strategy, and I should add that his work draws on many years of developing a methodology that provides an alternative to the OECD methodology for measuring trade subsidies, and there's a fabulous nerdy methodological note that he could steer you to for those who want to get into the details, but right now he's going to share the big picture with us. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and thanks to Jonathan and CIDE for convening this project, which has been, I think, very productive, having worked in Mexico for a long time and being part of the presentation of this in Mexico in September. I think I can echo what what the previous speakers have said about the impact it's had on the public discourse around these policies. It's been very, very important. I'm sort of providing background, in a way, as Jonathan says, to this to the larger study, which is about the implementation of Mexican agricultural policies in the NAFTA years. And my part of this is really trying to determine what that NAFTA part meant to Mexican producers. The research question that I was asked to answer is basically how much of U.S. farm policies cost Mexican producers under NAFTA? How can we quantify the impacts of U.S. farm policies in an environment of agricultural trade liberalization in which significant amounts of basic grains and meats have flowed into Mexico at a higher rate and at lower prices. So that's what I tried to do. And it's been something I'd been wanting to do for about 5 years, so this gave me the perfect excuse to finally go figure it out. The research steps are fairly straightforward here, and I'm going to run through, basically throw some numbers to you because I know we're short on time and we want to leave a lot of room for discussion. Basically give you the basic outlines of what we found and focus a little bit on corn because that's the particular subject of this study and obviously of greatest concern in Mexico. But basically we sought to identify the main agricultural products that were highly supported by U.S. farm policies, compete with Mexican producers, meaning Mexico produces these products, and that saw large increases in exports to Mexico after NAFTA. We estimated what we called a dumping margin, and I'll explain that a little bit more, but it's essentially the extent to which the product was exported at a price below its average production costs in the United States. That's one measure of dumping under the WTO. And then we estimated how much more Mexican producers would have earned if prices were not lowered by dumping. Okay, this is a fairly straightforward and simple calculation, so I don't want anybody to get the idea that we did any sophisticated econometrics here, but I do want you to understand that that it's straightforward enough that you can make sense of it. U.S. products flow into Mexico at low prices. They drive down Mexican prices to the extent that they're dumped, if that's 20% below the cost of production. If we assume that Mexican prices went down by that same 20%, how much more would Mexican producers have earned if they'd come in at prices 20% higher and Mexican producers had received prices 20% higher? Really straightforward. The dumping margins, like I said, one of the definitions, there's two definitions of dumping generally used. The more common one is understood to be discriminatory pricing, that is selling in a foreign market at a price below what you sell in your home market. Non-fat dry milk would be a good example of that in Mexico right now because the U.S. is using export subsidies to send non-fat dry milk into Mexico at prices below what non-fat dry milk costs in the U.S. This is not that kind of a situation. The other kind of dumping is used to calculate dumping in the cases of highly distorted markets, and subsidies are one of the things that highly distorts markets. So how do you decide what the true price of a commodity is when it's heavily subsidized, not only in the United States but in most exporting countries? So we calculated the dumping margin. Like I said, it's the difference between the export price from the United States and the average production costs, and we looked at it over a 9-year period from 1997 to 2005. Why 97 to 2005? 1997 represented the year that was both post-NAFTA, post-peso crisis, and finally, and perhaps most importantly, post-1996 Farm Bill. 1996 Farm Bill significantly liberalized and deregulated U.S. agricultural policy and resulted in a significant overproduction and a fall in prices. So dumping increased in part as a result of that policy. Why stop in 2005? Mainly because the commodity price spikes that were fueled in part by speculation started in the end of 2006. So this is as good a cutoff as any. You wouldn't want to include 2007, 2008 when the price spikes were going all over the place. As you can see, dumping margins were high, up to 38% for cotton. That means cotton was going into Mexico at 38% below what it cost to produce it in the United States. That is a proxy definition estimate of what U.S. agricultural policy was doing to depress export prices. Corn, on the other hand, was coming in at 19% below the cost of production. Beef, pork, and poultry were coming in at 5 to 10% below the cost of production, and in that we estimated that estimate based on the savings to meat producers of having below-cost feed, particularly in the form of below-cost corn and soybeans. The paper goes into more detail on that. The context was important because exports increased dramatically from the United States to Mexico under NAFTA for these 8 products. We looked at these 8 products because they met the criteria that I described before. There are other important products that were affected by trade or that are important to Mexican producers, such as beans. We didn't look at all these beans, sugar, sorghum, non-fat dry milk. All are products that are traded, but they have very different characteristics. So for different reasons, we excluded them. These 8 products represent 52% of the value of U.S. agricultural exports to Mexico, though. So it's not a small, this is a very representative sample. You can see that for corn, import dependency from the United States rose from 7 to 34%. In some cases, it was already high before NAFTA. Cotton, rice, soy, it was already over 50%. But the most worrisome are perhaps the cases where it was not that high before NAFTA, and it has since become quite significantly high or grown significantly, such as corn, wheat, and then the 3 meats. Here's the basic outline of the results. It's a lot of numbers. I don't actually like to put tables with lots of numbers up here, but let me just walk you through what these represent, and then I'll let you go back to the study to study them in more detail, but I'll talk a little bit more in detail about what this means for corn. The first column is the increase in exports from the United States to Mexico for these 8 products, and you can see it ranges from a low of 159% for soybeans to a high of 707% increase for pork. So all of these products saw dramatic increases in exports after NAFTA. The dumping margins you've already seen, all positive dumping margins, meaning they were going in below production costs. The next column is producer prices in Mexico. What happened to producer prices in Mexico? What trade theory predicts would have happened to producer prices in Mexico? They went down and went down dramatically. This is in real producer prices, adjusted for inflation, fell between 44 and 67% in that time. So again, this is for thinking about this from the perspective of the Mexican producer. You can see why there's been alarm over NAFTA. What happened to production? As Jonathan mentioned, for corn it actually increased 50% in the base years that we used. But for the other 4 crops, it declined, as you might expect, with low prices cutting the incentives to plant. For the meats, it actually increased, the bottom 3 lines there. And it increased because the consumption of meat is increasing dramatically, even as imports are increasing at the same time. The last column is the punchline, and the punchline here is that's the estimated losses to Mexican producers of dumping level prices and imports from the United States, and it shows at the very bottom a total of $12.8 billion over 9 years in losses. Anything that has the word billion sounds like a lot, and sometimes it's not. In this case, it is. That represents about 10% of the total value of Mexican agricultural exports to the United States. So 10% of the entire value of Mexican agricultural exports to the U.S. It represents more than the total value of Mexican tomato exports to the United States, which are one of NAFTA's great success stories for Mexico, the increase in tomato exports. And flagging a couple of these, corn accounts for half of the losses here, $6.6 billion in losses. That's over $700 million a year. And I'll go into that in more detail now. I won't tell the sad story of Mexico not implementing the tariff rate quota system under NAFTA, which would have allowed it to impose tariffs to slow the transition to a free market over 14 years through the beginning of 2008. That bottom line, the NAFTA quota, is the level that they had to allow in without tariffs. The amount above that came is the amount that did come in without Mexico charging basically any significant tariff on those imports. Imports increased 413%. Prices fell by 2/3. As Jonathan said, production actually, the blue part of the bar actually increased by 50%, but import dependency went from 7 to 34% in that time. Here's what the annual costs of corn dumping look like. The line represents the dumping margin on the right axis, so that's the percent. So at its peak in 2000, it actually approached 35%, meaning, again, what that means is corn was going into Mexico from the United States at 35% below what it costs to produce it in the United States. The losses in the bars are the actual dollar losses to Mexican producers. How much more would they have earned if they had received those higher prices? And as you can see, the losses were very high, and there were only 2 years, in 96 and 2004, until the most recent price spikes when there wasn't a dumping margin and therefore there weren't losses. What does this represent for Mexican producers? The best way to think about it, because Mexico has so many producers and produces so much corn, is on a per hectare basis. So we translated those numbers into per hectare figures, and it represents, on average, for the 9 years we studied, $99 per hectare. For the smallest producers, that's a tremendous loss. That basically eliminates any hope of positive returns from corn production. But as Jonathan also pointed out, this is more than the value of the Mexican subsidy payment under Procampo per hectare. So that has very serious implications for U.S. agricultural policy, which is why this larger study is so important. Because Procampo, to the extent Procampo payments, as John said and Mauricio said before, were at least initially intended to help make Mexican producers compete more effectively. Instead, all they were doing was partially and only partially making up for the losses from dumping by the United States. Mexico could have charged tariffs in all of the years that we looked at here in which there was positive dumping. And you can translate these dumping margin figures into the tariffs that they could have charged, would have needed to charge to truly level the playing field in any of those years. Would have reached 50% in the year 2000. That would have been legal under NAFTA, but the Mexican government chose not to do it. Would that have made a difference? The line is the difference between international and domestic corn prices in 5 of the years, of the 9 years we looked at. It would have made Mexican corn actually, made it more competitive than U.S. imported corn. The tariffs would have raised the price on imported corn above the level of Mexican corn production and made Mexican corn producers competitive on a straight cost, straight price basis. And in other years, it would have significantly decreased the losses and the price differential. What conclusions can we draw from all of this? Well, First, these estimates actually understate the overall impact, because the other impact of higher prices would have been a supply response, right? It actually has been documented that in 2007, when market prices went up for corn, and they went up 23%, there was a 3.5% increase in plantings of corn in Mexico. So corn land went up 3.5%. That's what you'd expect. If prices are higher, it's worth it to invest. It's worth it to plant, and you would have seen an increase in plantings. We didn't have the time or the economic models to actually estimate what that would have meant. But I think it's reliable. It's safe to say that our estimates, because they don't count that, are low. Second, NAFTA created an incentive for subsidies, basically because it disciplined the use of tariffs as protection, but it didn't discipline the use of subsidies in agricultural support. In the WTO, there are 3 pillars that are all talked about at the same time in the agricultural negotiations: export subsidies, domestic support, and tariffs. NAFTA just eliminated the use of tariffs and eliminated it completely after the transition period, leaving a situation where a highly subsidized U.S. agriculture coming with crops coming into Mexico, Mexico's remaining policy response is primarily to subsidize, and that's what you've seen is an increase in Mexican subsidies. It makes it all the more important for the kinds of policies that this project has talked about to be taken seriously, because if that's what Mexico is going to do, it better do its subsidizing well, and it hasn't been doing it so well. Third, the WTO's emerging disciplines on agricultural protection are instructive, particularly the special products exemption, which allows developing countries to exempt certain products that are key to food production, food security, and rural development, to exempt them from liberalization. Corn would clearly qualify in Mexico, so would beans. And the special safeguard mechanism, which would allow for tariffs to be put in place if there were import surges, as we've seen under NAFTA. The sad fact is that NAFTA, as a trade agreement, supersedes the WTO. So even if those come into being in the WTO, Mexico will not be able to use them against the United States. So that leaves Mexico with very few policy options, and they need to get the subsidies right. Finally, dumping is not a thing of the past. A lot of people would like to think that, or are scared to think that the current regime of high prices is going to continue on into the future forever. I don't think history tells us that that's what's going to happen. Most of the projections don't say that's what's going to happen. And I think it's quite likely that within a matter of years, you could well see prices export prices below the cost of production again, and dumping returning. In the meantime, though, I just emphasize 2 things that come out of the other parts of this report. There are other market distortions in agriculture that are absolutely critical and that are part of agricultural trade as well. One is the issue of access to credit. The absolutely shocking number to me that comes out of this study is that 4% of Mexican producers have access to credit, according to the agricultural census. 4%. Find a farmer in the United States that doesn't have access to credit. There is no level playing field here. This is no fair competition, and it's a complete market failure in Mexico. That, again, that's why governments intervene when markets fail. The second is corporate concentration. Very little. The argument for not enforcing NAFTA was to allow, to protect against food inflation, and to allow food prices to be kept down. But tortilla prices have not been kept down, largely because of monopoly control in that sector. Again, that's an area where the government has to intervene strongly. We have other reports at our institute on NAFTA and its impact on Mexico, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Tim. Okay. So, fortunately, we've got half an hour for your questions and brief comments. If you could just please identify yourself first. Why don't we take several, and thanks for the help with the mic in back. I think there's one over there. Yes, Robert.
Robert Blecker, American University. Oh, sorry. Robert Blecker, American University. Hola, amigos. This is really interesting, but I'm going to ask a challenging question. John started out the presentation by citing what I think are some fairly well-known stylized facts of the last 15 years. That in spite of expectations, agricultural production, or excuse me, corn production did rise in Mexico, whereas more consistent with expectations, agricultural employment fell, and so forth and so on. I don't need to repeat all your points, but I didn't hear the circle closed. How do all these analyses of the U.S. policies, the Mexican policies, both agricultural and the poverty policies, how does it all explain that? And I realize it's complicated. There's different kinds of corn. There's many different agricultural producers. But how do we square the circle? That's the wrong metaphor. Connect the dots. How do we come back to explain the stylized facts? How much of the anomalies and what happened can be explained by these policies as compared to something else? And another specific question for Tim is, presumably U.S. exports of agricultural products to Mexico would have increased even in the absence of the dumping. So do you have any estimates of what part of the increased imports are due to the selling below average total cost, and what part would have happened otherwise? Just a quick question for you: is that $12.8 billion annual or total?
Total.
Total.
1.4 billion a year.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Robert. A couple more. Yes.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Vicki Gass, and I'm with the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA. I just have a question for all of you, and I want to set aside Tim's astonishing points about only 4% of Mexican producers have access to credit and the issue of the corporate concentration. My question is this. If, with government intervention, prices were high, and for instance, corn production in Mexico, and instead of subsidizing inequality, the Mexican government was subsidizing equality, would the playing field have been more level? Would the poorer producers become less poor?
Andrew.
I think this presentation is a very interesting study. I have three questions for Tim on this, actually. One is just on differences of corn. I mean, what are we comparing white corn to white corn, or are these different kinds of corn? Was yellow corn from the U.S. supplanting white corn in some way? I mean, can you comment on that? Secondly, and this is a question from Steve Zanizer of USDA, and he asked me to ask it, so I'm going to ask it to you. What would have happened if Mexican producers had a more level playing field? Where would the corn have been grown? Is there land for that? So I throw that out there as his question. And he asked me that at another meeting, actually, when I presented some of your results. So, and finally, I mean, what about the argument that, yes, this is too bad for corn farmers, for people with low acreage, low hectareage, but overall, this was good for consumers, both, as you see, I mean, from what John showed us, I mean, increasingly, people in rural areas, particularly the lower quintiles, are actually consumers of agricultural products and not the producers. So to what extent would this have actually, is this, hey, I mean, some people in the government will say this was a good thing overall,
Thank you. I'm going to take a quick stab at some of those, and then we'll take another round to see if Tim and others want to join in. But just to start with the last one first, there's a box in the first chapter by Erica Simmons, who's finishing a doctorate at the University of Chicago, on that question, and found basically the imported price of corn goes like this, and the tortilla price goes like this in Mexico City. So the promised benefits for consumers were simply not delivered, as Tim mentioned briefly in passing, because of presumably oligopolistic wholesale markets for corn. On the question that Robert posed on corn production, I have a proposed explanation. I can't claim that it's the answer, but the usual answer is that many small producers have kind of retreat to those who don't leave, and the rate of emigration grew in Mexico through the 90s. Not a coincidence, but of those who stayed, that corn becomes a a safety net, their own social insurance, with the added incentive that Procampo, to continue accessing Procampo, you're required to continue to produce. And not only that, even though in theory you're allowed to change crops, in the back pages of the official evaluations that almost no one reads, it turns out that the surveys show that most producers didn't know that they had the right to change out of corn, so that they thought that to keep getting that in a good year $100 a hectare, you had to keep growing corn. But that's not enough to explain. That's enough to explain why production continued, not enough to explain the dramatic increase in production. So small producers can't explain the increase. That's where state intervention is key. The ones who are this top sort of 250,000 producers who were getting ingreso objetivo were getting those payments on a per ton basis in addition to their per hectare Procampo payments. Everyone in ingreso objetivo was getting Procampo also, and the ingreso objetivo, the best data we could find was in another obscure 2005 official evaluation. Ingreso objetivo payments, the ones that protected big growers from international prices, covered 70% of the volume of grain and oilseed production in Mexico. So that alone is enough to explain the increase. I think that we're not getting into other subsidies that are tilted upwards, like for the electricity, for the pumps for irrigation, the undercost irrigation water, the capital investments in bigger and better tractors that displace farm labor. There's a whole series of other subsidies that we didn't even touch. But basically, the short answer is the government paid big growers to use labor displacing technology to grow corn on a larger scale in the north. That doesn't mean that the old crop price support system, the precio de garantía that this took the place of, would have been more equitable. That was also inequitable. That paid producers a floor price on a per ton basis, so that it treated unequal producers equally. And it also, like Procampo, didn't reach, by definition, the subsistence producers who didn't have a surplus to market. Procampo was less inequitable because it does reach at least some subsistence producers. And even those who had a surplus to market, most of them lived too far away from the government crop reception centers to get access to the support price. So that the support price became politically a symbol of the government's commitment to the peasant economy, even though it turned out not to be true in practice. So there was a disconnect there. Procampo, in principle, could be much more equitable if there was a low ceiling on the number of hectares covered, like it only covered the top 10 or 20 hectares. And by shaving the money off that was going to the big guys, if that money were used to pay much higher per hectare payments to the smallest producers and actually reach all of them, instead of excluding the majority of particularly indigenous 1 or 2 or 3 hectare owners, that in principle Procampo could be dramatically more redistributive than it actually is. But going back to the old system, paying people based on how much they grew, if they sold it on the market, would not be more equitable. So I don't know if others want to add something. John, please.
I would like to say something about your last point, because I think it's very important. Fortunately, this panel is plural in opinion. I also think that I would see if we did a distributive analysis of this $12 billion, it would be highly progressive, I think, because farmers, as we saw, farm income is concentrated in large farmers in the top of the rural income distribution, whereas consumers are, obviously, as we saw, farm income is less important, increasingly less important for poor producer, for poor rural households. So they would have gained much more on the consumption side than they lost than they lost on the production side. No? So I think that was a good decision a correct decision of allowing imports of corn production. And despite the increase in tortilla prices, something very strange happened in Mexico in the years of the 2002 crisis, which is that poverty decreased in years where there was a recession in Mexico, which was very strange to us who were measuring poverty. We were scared about the data. No, we thought, how could that be? No, how are we going to present those data to the public? Nobody will believe us. And the reason why that happened is because there was price deflation in agriculture, in food, in the food basket. And one of the main reasons was that policy of allowing the quotas to overshoot. No, so I think I would see that I think a distributive incidence analysis of that policy. I don't know if there's has been any, would have been highly pro-poor. I think it's basically a way for Mexico to internalize American subsidies in favor of Mexican consumers. No. Another example, notable example in the case of Mexico, is one of the oldest food subsidy programs in Mexico for consumers is Liconza. It's a program of subsidized milk for the poor, and that for many years was free for Mexico. It was actually because it was subsidized by the dumping of milk from richer countries. No, and that was a very successful program in terms of poverty alleviation. Also, just to make that clear.
Thank you. Tim, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, let me go back to a slide that might help explain one piece of one part of the question that I think, in a way, two of you asked. So in part, in response to Vicky's question and Robert's, Robert, I don't think I can say what percent of how much lower would U.S. exports have been if dumping level prices had not been present. But one way to, again, these are all very rough approximations, right? But one way to look at each of these products, and you see the drop in producer prices in Mexico in the third column, the dumping margin in the second. One way to think about that is, let's say that 19 percentage points of the 66 percentage points of the drop in producer prices in Mexico was owed to dumping. So that is to say, we produce corn cheaper than Mexico does, so we can outcompete Mexican producers, so we can export corn at prices cheaper than Mexico can grow it under normal conditions. So the playing field isn't, to start with, a level playing field in the sense that Mexican producers didn't start off and didn't get significantly more competitive with U.S. producers. But that gives you an idea of the share of that price difference that might have been accounted for by dumping, by U.S. agricultural policies forcing up production and forcing prices down. So that's one inadequate answer to your question. Vicky's question about would the playing field have been more level if Mexican government policy had been better? Well, I don't know. If you were asking if would it have been level, the answer is no. Would it have been more level? The answer is yes, I think. And I think these panelists would probably have more to say about that than I would. But one of the significant aspects that I think is very clear in the study is the shift in Mexican spending in its agriculture, a decline in Mexican spending initially and then an increase in agricultural spending generally, and a shift away from productive investment in infrastructure, in the kinds of things that increase productivity, and a shift away from the kinds of things that increase productivity among the smallest producers. So those shifts, if you imagine a completely different set of people deciding what to do with that same money, I think this project is saying, yeah, you could have seen something very different. So I think that's important. Andrew, in response to Stephen Zonheiser's always provocative questions about yellow versus white corn, I just want to say that ask Victor Suarez in Mexico about yellow versus white corn, and he'll say it's all about price. You can feed white corn to livestock. Maybe you don't want to feed it to poultry to laying hens because they want the yolks to be yellow and yellower, and the yellow corn produces yellower yolks. No lie. But the nutritional properties of white corn are very comparable to the nutritional properties of yellow corn for feed. And what Victor points out is that as soon as the price spike happened, Mexican livestock producers started buying white corn from Mexican producers to feed their livestock. There was a market for that, and demand went up. And in fact, I think that is one of the explanations for the increase in production of white corn in Mexico. It isn't just for tortillas. It is actually getting used for other things. And there's a rising demand there's rising production of meat in Mexico, rising demand for meat in Mexico. So that's a market that the domestic corn producers can actually help fill. And where would corn have been grown in Mexico? Too long a story, but Antonio Torrent, who's one of the deans of of corn research in Mexico and corn productivity research, says that even, I think the last estimate I saw was that even without bringing new land into production and without using genetically modified crops, Mexico could increase its production to 30 million metric tons from what it hit 25 this year, I think. And if it reformed agricultural tenure laws principally and did small-scale irrigation projects in the South, it could double its corn production. That would be bringing grazed land into corn production, extensively grazed land into corn production. And the last one was is it good for poor consumers? I think Johnny answered that. I think the one thing that is where consumers in general, and I take issue a little bit with what John said, I think where consumers in Mexico have seen the benefit of those cheaper feed grains in particular is in cheaper meat. I think meat has become more affordable. But again, that's not the poor who are eating meat. The poorest of the poor in Mexico still basically don't eat meat. They can't afford it. So it's the lower and middle classes having better access to meat, and you see that in the data that there's been a rise in meat consumption.
Thanks. I'm just going to mention two other relevant programs that are important for understanding the social impact on the consumer side. There is still in Mexico a vast rural consumer subsidy program, 23,000 community-managed village stores that are supplied by Diconsa, the institutional bathtub ring of what once was Conasupo. And it's alive and well because of the organized power of millions of rural consumers who have their committees and their regional councils that serve as checks and balances to encourage this program to actually deliver low-cost basic staples to their villages. And that is a program that subsidizes the transportation costs to remote areas, but not the price. So insofar as the consumer price is low, that particular program will deliver to those 23,000 villages cheaper basic staples, including corn, than they would otherwise have access to. And then another program that we have a whole chapter on in the study, and a much more extensive monograph version is about a government policy we haven't talked about, which does fund the key policy that Tim mentioned, which is to finance productivity increasing investments, capital investments, which would include, for example, tractors with the mixed impact that I've alluded to on labor, but it would also fund shears for small-scale coffee producers to improve the productivity of their coffee plants and so forth. A program long known as Alianza para el Campo, and changed the name recently to the program of Adquisición de Activos Productivos. And this program, unlike the ones we looked at, has been turned over to the state governments, which basically makes it impossible, even harder than in the federal programs, to know where the money goes, because state governments are, almost without exception, even more opaque than the federal government. So we've got time for another couple of comments, questions, please.
I actually have a question about the transparency point. After all of the information became public, how many people who were on that list, especially the ones that got the most money out of the government, how many of them actually received threats or were actually abducted after the public information?
Thank you. And you are?
Oh, sorry. Armando Jose Perezia from CNA.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Other? Yes, there's another one here.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Carlos Alonso. My question is about what kind of movements do you see for those who are trying to reform the subsidy policy, is there a movement among the rural poor, especially among rural corn producers, to reform the policy? Or is there a situation in which they're uninformed due to their poverty status, and so do they not know anything and have no movements? Or is it even worse in that they're receiving misinformation from a lot of the established interests to continue with the policy because maybe they're believing that it helps them when in reality it doesn't help them?
Great questions. One more in back there. Yes, sir. Okay. And then you, okay, well, while you were waiting on the mic for him, why don't you go ahead? Yeah.
Eric Hansen, Meridian Institute. I'm just wondering what kind of lessons from this study can be applied to other countries in agriculture globally, especially outside of NAFTA.
Thanks. And one in back, still waiting? Okay. I guess we've got a dead mic there.
Hi. Dennis Gilbert, Hamilton College. You talked about corruption in terms of individuals, and in particular individual officials enriching themselves. I wonder how much jockeying for partisan political advantage there is in the program, how that's affected the distribution of benefits. I noticed in the last 2 elections, the PRI still gets the majority of the rural poor, except in the South. And I just wonder, was any difference between the PRI administrations and the PON administrations? What's happening politically with this, particularly with Pro-Campo?
Thank you. I think it's Dr. Merino's turn, and then Olivia as well. So.
Yes. Well, the last is a very good question because we expected the policy to be changed after the alternation in the presidential power, no? But it didn't happen. And the reason is perhaps because the government, the new government, ruled by the Partido Acción Nacional, decided to get a kind of instrument to raise the political stability in the country. So we saw in this study, it is not an easy task simply to interrupt or even to change or even to give some little reforms in the rules of operation of this program, because we are talking about 2,200,000 people in the country, and the most of them against, even although the more of the money is going to the richest, the most of the list of beneficiaries is not only poor people, but is people who is living thanks to this subsidy. So the government should find another kind of support to these people in the countryside, and they don't have it at all. So I suppose that they decided to go for the easy way, and the easy way is to maintain this policy, to give more of the people the subsidy, and then to discuss what to do with this policy. Just as a speculation, because I have not a better explanation. I interviewed, I had a conversation with the managers of the programs, and they were very conscious about the predominance of the Partido Revolucionario Institucional in the list of beneficiaries. But they were trying to get a kind of competition, a political competition, trying to turn the clientelistic style, now to the Partido Acción Nacional. I think that they lost, and as you told before, we are seeing that the permanence of the predominio of the Partido Revolucionario Institucional in the elections is still there, and is still the most probably that the PRI is going to win the presidency in the 2012. No, of course I am speculating, but I'm speculating based on the data available about the election and the partisan preferences. No, that's why, also it's so difficult to change this policy, because it is very important to get the political stability there. No, if you don't have any other policy, you cannot, if you are the state, if you're chief of the state, only to avoid this policy and to change these subsidies. No? This is why, as well, there is not many movements. Only almost 10% of the original registered list is moved, and it is because the land is the thing to be subsidized, and not the people. So the land could be changed the hands, and even could be people who is not anymore there, but the land is still receiving the subsidies. So the register list is almost original from 1994. I hadn't no time enough in my original presentation to say as well that that lists were integrated in 6 months, and it was integrated thanks to the support of the CNC. Among others, but especially the CNC. The CNC is the Confederación Nacional Campesina, which is as you know, the arm, the peasant arm of, how to say it, of the Partido Revolucionario Institucional. No? So CNC was very involved in the integration of the first list of beneficiaries, and CNC is still there. So the movements are, how to say it, very linked to the political interest. And, well, I think that's enough.
Thanks.
I think that it's an excellent question. Exactly how often has the publication of this information led to someone being subject to extortion? I think it's a difficult issue to even try and measure. And I think anyone's security being under threat is a massive problem that requires a substantial attention. I do, however, think it's very difficult to tie those types of activities and increases in those types of activities in certain areas to the publication of information about who's receiving what from farm subsidies. I think it's important to point out that these lists have been publicly available since 2003. There's only been accusations that the publication of that information has led to acts of extortion in the past year. I'm sure that that it doesn't diminish the importance of any one time that happens. If it's happened even once, it's a problem. But it is not necessarily that easy to generalize claims that the main source of those types of problems is the publication of government information about subsidy payments. And in terms of the question about what kinds of movements there are to reform subsidy policy, there are significant movements to reform subsidy policy. Unfortunately, the vested interests that have captured the policies up until now are in more powerful negotiating positions than those who would seek to reform the policy at this particular point in time. There have been a number of attempts at legislative reform that would integrate farm subsidy policy into something much more like a farm bill. Right now, there is nothing other than Procampo that receives sort of a long-term budget planning in terms of agricultural support programs. And one of the main farmer demands, especially from small and medium-sized farmers, would be to increase the predictability of the types of support that will be available from one year to the next. And in the context of doing that, proposals to reform Procampo, specifically to cap payments, to increase the payments to smaller farmers, to increase the predictability of the timing of those payments and try to reduce the impact of intermediaries who would charge interest on pro campo loans, things like that. Those proposals have been made, and they've actually even been solidified into legislative proposals that got stuck in the Senate, unfortunately. And I think it's a very important point to highlight. There are well-informed groups of small and medium-sized farmers who are actively seeking to make the types of adjustments to existing subsidy policy that we're talking about. And one of the other points that I think is particularly interesting is there are even farmers within some of those states who are most highly benefited from the concentration of farm subsidy payments who are actively seeking reform as well, in the sense that just because Tamaulipas receives a disproportionate amount of agricultural spending doesn't mean that all the farmers in Tamaulipas are being equally benefiting from that concentration in spending. And so there's even some awareness that's being built at the level of farmers who are being increasingly made aware of the degree to which they're excluded from significant public investments and making demands about how those situations need to be rectified. So, thank you.
Thanks. One of the issue areas where the organized, independent, nonpartisan smallholders have the most influence over the policy process is an issue area that we didn't look at here, which is in the coffee sector. And the entire coffee policy was developed very much in partnership with producer organizations, and it's not simply a kind of a welfare policy or a transfer policy, but it's indicative of the direction of agricultural policy that the Secretary of Agriculture a couple months ago proposed the complete elimination of the coffee support program. Because of their clout in Congress, part of the program was put back and so forth, but it gives you a sense of where family farmers fit in. And if you want to get a sense of the way in which these kind of issues are discussed among peasant organizations, take a look at the monthly Rural Affairs supplement of La Jornada newspaper called La Jornada del Campo, which has its own operation, and in fact the September issue we basically put out extracts from this work to make sure that it would reach beyond the usual suspects. So it was a really good question about how accessible is information about this. I think it's the custom to end on time, so I'm going to turn over to Andrew, and thank you very much for coming, and thanks to our panelists.